Good afternoon and welcome to Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I'm the host, Chris Whitehead, and we are getting to about a topic today I've been interested in quite some time because I guess just to give a little bit more background in case certain people haven't listened to past episodes. I've been an air quality nerd for about 20 years now, and the last 5 or 6, especially focusing a lot on climate change impacts. One of the impacts you see more about almost every day now is wildfire. It's always been something that's interested me. So of course, part of natural processes, then also one of the fastest growing climate impacts. So I just have so many questions on the topic. I wanted to put some homework in and get to the biggest experts, in my opinion, in North America on the topic. But before we get there, I wanted to give a little bit of a baseline for you and actually share my screen, which is something I don't do too terribly often, just to talk about a couple of things very, very quickly. Wildfires, and I'm sorry, can one you confirm you see this also as well?
Yes, I
I
see
can
it.
see it.
Beautiful. And if it wasn't clear from that, this is also going to be edited too. So stuff like this conversation can be chopped out. So thank you for that. Wildfires are happening more often than they have in the past. From just in case anyone who's not actually watching the video now, right around the time I was born, 1983, you're talking about 20,000 wildfires or so ballpark in the United States. Now that's up to almost 80,000 in a relatively small amount of time. That should trouble you. Not only that, the wildfires are taking more acres drastically, especially from the year 2000 till today. There's a sharp uptick. Again, extremely, extremely troubling. As we're speaking right now, the park fire in California, which has only been burning for just over a week, has already consumed approximately 400,000 acres. And the amount of resources that are being put to try to fight this fire, just to give you a little bit of perspective, and the website we're currently looking at is fire.california.gov. Almost 6,000 personnel, 41 helicopters, dozers, water tankers, huge, huge effort. And unfortunately, this isn't that rare anymore, and sadly, it's becoming kind of common. And it might sound abstract to you, or like, oh, that's a problem, but doesn't necessarily affect me. And thank you to the Atlantic, obviously, for these photos as well. It hits home for a lot of people, and it's something that many who hadn't had to deal with this in the past are having to now. And when I see photos like this, first my heart just breaks for them. But I think back to those graphs I showed earlier and just the unsettling trend we're on here. But then I also start to thinking back to past year or so, all the smoke that came down from the fires in Canada and just basically blanketed the East Coast. What's in that smoke? And we again going to be talking to a couple of experts today that can give more answers. And frankly, I can, but also hopefully instill us with a little bit of hope on the topic because a lot of this is pretty daunting stuff. When we look at pictures like this and the efforts that go into fighting these things, it can be pretty overwhelming. So I wanted to spend some time to talk about what's going on, how these wildfires are being modeled, what possible mitigation efforts are out there, and just basically learn as much as we can. So I've been talking for far too long. With that, I think I'm going to bring on the experts now. So I'm going to welcome Christine Wiedinmyer from University of Colorado and Sarah Henderson from the city in British Columbia. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having
Hi.
us.
I'm very, very excited for this one, as I'm sure you can tell. I don't like doing extended intros because I generally botch them. So can you each please tell me what how you chose wildfire as the topic you want to dedicate your time to professionally? And maybe a little bit background as well if you can. And Sarah first, maybe?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sarah Henderson. I'm the scientific director of environmental health at the BC Centre for Disease Control, and I'm also a professor at the School of Population and Public Health at the University of British Columbia. I've been studying the health effects of wildfire smoke in populations for more than 20 years now. I'm an environmental engineer to begin with. That's where I started my career in air pollution abatement and control. I switched to environmental epidemiology when I got quite interested in the public health consequences of engineering decisions. And when I was starting my PhD in 2003, I had intended to study the impacts of some changes to fuel in Canada and the sulfur content of fuels in Canada. And then the 2003 wildfire season happened in BC, which at the time was a record-setting season. When we look back, it now looks like a tiny little season in comparison, but we'd never had a season like that before in the province. And I thought, wow, that's a really interesting form of air pollution. It's not regulatable the way air pollution from cars is, or the way air pollution from industry is. It can be very extreme. It's highly changeable, and I've remained fascinated by it ever since.
Thank you very much. Christine?
Yeah, I'm actually also an engineer, and I'm at the University of Colorado now at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences. I got into this topic because my research and my career has focused on understanding pollution sources and their air quality impacts. That's what I studied in graduate school. I did a lot of work not only on anthropogenic or people-made pollution, but also the emissions from vegetation. You know, you walk through a pine forest and you smell that pine forest smell. These are a lot of organic compounds that are emitted in the atmosphere. And when you mix them with what comes out of the tailpipe of a car, it can change the composition of the atmosphere and maybe even contribute to ozone pollution. So we looked at those dynamics, those emissions, and then that's undisturbed vegetation. And then I kind of moved into what happens when you disturb the vegetation, when you burn it through different like wildland fires. So that's how I transitioned into looking at wildfires, and living here in the West, it's become more and more prominent in our day-to-day lives. We have 3 fires burning within 20 miles of my house right now. It's something that I've really focused on because not only does it, you know, impact so many people, it's something that directly impacts me daily. And it is, as Sarah said, a really challenging problem because it's not something like we can go in and put a catalytic converter on the tailpipe of our car and help control those emissions. It's something that you know, it's a really challenging regulatory problem, land management problem, public health problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think an interesting spot to start might be can can you guys talk a little bit about how wildfires have gotten stronger over the years and how this isn't the natural benefit, the natural system that actually has some positives, how climate change has exacerbated all this?
Yeah, do you want to go first, Sarah, or should I?
You go first, and then I'll add anything I think needs to be added.
Okay.
Yeah, well, there, you know, there's a lot of ecosystems that we have in the world that rely on fire to for its health and to propagate. A lot of the forest systems in North America are like fire. They appreciate fire when it's in a natural system. What we've seen across the Western United States and into Canada over the last 20, 30 years is increased dryness, hotter summers, a buildup of fuels that have led to, like you showed this at the beginning, more fires, larger fires, fires that are burning more severely. So they're not just burning the understory, they're actually burning the whole canopy. We are also seeing longer seasons. So in the past, August and September, sometimes July is when we saw a lot of the wildland fires across the Western United States. That's being expanded into October. And now we've actually had the most fire support and the highest I guess, a response from in July. I just heard this on the news today from the National Fire Coordination Center. So we're seeing that. We're also seeing fires that are because of the dryness and the changes in temperature. We're also seeing that fires don't tend to die down as much in the nighttime. So it's making a more challenging problem for firefighters. Yeah, and so this has been tied to a lot of different climatic variables, the temperature, the dryness, the aridity in the forest. It's also been tied to the density of the forest and the amount of biomass available to burn. So I'll leave it at that. And Sarah, if you have anything else to add.
I'll say it's very similar in the Canadian context. One of the differences being that we have a large amount of boreal forest in Canada, and that's different from the US. When I speak with our wildfire experts nationally about this, we really talk about an intersection of two things that are happening right now. First is historic land management practices, and second is climate change. So because we haven't liked fire on the landscape, and we've omitted fire from the landscape, those naturally flammable systems that Christine was talking about, we've had this carbon buildup or this fuel buildup by fire exclusion. And at the same time, the weather is now getting hotter, drier, and windier, and those are the conditions that fire loves. So we have that fuel buildup or that carbon bubble, these really intense fire conditions coming together to put us in a situation that's just unprecedented from anywhere we've ever been previously. And one of the things we talk about a lot in Canada is returning to sort of indigenous land management practices, where we know that the indigenous people who lived here pre-settlement actually applied fire to the landscape in a very systematic and thoughtful way to ensure that they were using fire to the best advantage of their own needs and the needs of the landscape. And I think as the years progress, we are likely to see more of this cultural and prescribed burning in Canada. And I know that's happening in the US as well.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. And Sarah, as you were speaking just then, I got to thinking about the causes of the fire, like what actually initially gets them going. I've heard it's most often lightning, but then there are instances like the park fire. Unfortunately, there was a guy pushed a burning car into a wooded gully. I mean, I'm not asking if anything that overt is common, but is encroachment by people into the forests or fireworks or anything we're doing causing more of this to even start?
What we see in Canada is that early in the season, more of the fires do tend to be human caused, while when we get into that kind of drier, more lightning prone weather, that's when we see more lightning related wildfire starts. Oftentimes, fires that are human caused, there is more success with suppression because they tend to be inhabited areas where folks are nearby anyway but that's not always true. Regardless, we still see human-caused fires every year, and that is a controllable source of fire. We need to do everything we can do to reduce those human-related ignitions. And then I think what you're talking about is, these individuals who are taking disruptive action. They understand that the landscape is very volatile and sensitive, and are using that for whatever reason. We don't talk a lot about that in Canada. There's a lot of hesitancy to talk about deliberate setting of fire to the landscape when we know conditions are very poor. But I'm sure that it happens, and I'm sure that it happens in the US as well. And that's, I guess it's a form of terrorism more than anything else.
Yeah, just an interesting side note is in the US, we actually see a spike in wildland fires on the 4th of July. If you look at the climatic
Interesting.
data,
Yeah.
it definitely pokes out. There's a study by Jennifer Balch at the University of Colorado that showed that, which is, shows that there is a human influence on the fire.
And
Fire
there's been a
starts, at
couple of
least.
big fires in the US. I don't think this has happened in Canada for like baby gender reveal parties.
Oh, I've
don't
heard
get me
that.
started on those.
Exactly, where, something so frivolous as
Yes.
announcing the sex of your baby, even gender is a strong word to use there, and it's lighting, setting off fireworks, and then,
Yes.
very large fires have been started by these kinds of activities. So
Yeah. And another thing I really wanted to get into and spend some time on today is once these fires get started and start burning for a while, what's actually in the smoke that comes off of it and what potential health impacts are there for people who breathe it in? I would assume there's some variability, obviously, because if you're unfortunately going through populated areas, you're going to be burning things like plastics and all that aren't going to be as prevalent in forests themselves.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff in smoke. That's one of the things I do is try to predict what is coming out of fires and then hopefully give it to someone like Sarah who could tell me what happens when that fire gets out and people get exposed to it. So we have everything from particles, big particles as well as those fine particles that you can breathe in and they get lodged deep in the lungs. And then that's just particles. The particles can have a lot of different components that may impact air quality, the climate, the local weather, and then downwind impacts and health. And I'll let Sarah talk more about that. And then we have a whole bunch of different gases from greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. So you're changing and interrupting the carbon cycle, to reactive gases that can react and form particles. They can react to impact ground level ozone, which is a pollutant. So there's a whole host of different things. And we can talk about fires in the wildland urban interface. I'm just talking about biomass burning in a wildland setting right now. But we've seen that when you burn through, so I live in Superior, Colorado. My neighborhood burned in the Marshall Fire 2 years ago. We had 1,000 homes burned. I was fortunate enough to have no damage other than some smoke damage to my home, but it was a huge concern to people about what burned in our neighborhood and how it impacted the houses that were still standing, because we had cars burning and houses and you're like plastics. And so what we see is there are a lot of other things that are burned when you start burning structures and vehicles and urban materials that can also play a role in detrimental air quality and impacting health and even ecosystems. So
yeah, to sort of step back and look at from the public health perspective, the literature has grown immensely in the past decade or so. When I first started in this game, there was like a handful of papers on wildland fire smoke impacts, and now there's hundreds and hundreds, which is fantastic. And much like the literature around air pollution in general, overall, all of the evidence suggests that wildfire smoke is bad for people. And it's bad for people any way you want to look at it. Like any outcome or endpoint that we look at, it's bad for that. So a paper just came out yesterday. It actually didn't come out there's a paper under review, but it's been getting some news time around dementia. And they looked at different types of particles and found that particles from wildland fire smoke were more associated with dementia than any other kind of particles. There's been papers around diabetes and people being able to control their diabetes when it's smoky or not smoky. There's heart attacks. So in every possible way, wildland fire smoke is bad for humans. Now, most of these studies so far have looked at it on the short-term time scale. So when the fire is happening and there's smoke happening, what are the health outcomes associated with those exposures? But more and more, we're turning our attention to like, oh, you've been exposed to smoke, pretty much every year for 20 years. What does that mean for your health in the long term? Because we know that if you live in a polluted city, that you are much higher risk of a whole number of chronic diseases and you're going to have a shorter life expectancy. Is that true for wildfire smoke as well if you're routinely exposed to it? We don't know yet. And wildfire smoke is a little bit different from living in a highly polluted city because it's really episodic. Like you might have a month of smoke and then 3 years without smoke and then 6 more months with a little bit of smoke. And like it's very different from air pollution from other sources. Overall, the indicators are that smoke is harmful. It may be more harmful than pollution from other sources, especially when it has aged in the atmosphere for a while. So those chemical changes that Christine's talking about lead to smoke or air pollution that has more oxidative potential, which means that when it interacts with your body, it wants to steal oxygen molecules from your body, and that's generally a bad thing. And that's when we're just looking at wildland fuels alone. The moment we add anthropogenic fuels to that mixture, we just have to assume it's more toxic, it's more damaging, all of those things.
Interesting.
On the other hand, and this again, I'm going to do this from a public health perspective. So I really, really, really want people to protect themselves from smoke exposures and to take whatever measures they can to reduce their exposure to wildfire smoke. On the other hand, I do not want people to lock themselves inside all summer because that is not a public health win. People need to socialize, they need to be outdoors, they need to exercise, and we can maladapt to wildfire smoke in a way that's not good for our health as well. So there's this really balance to be struck when we're talking about these exposures and how to manage them as a society and building resilience to them in populations.
Thank you for saying that, Sarah. It's actually a question that came to me from a colleague just this morning. She's like, I have asthma, but I look at the air quality alerts and what should I do? Because I have to get outside. Like I can't be inside for like all week. I'll go, it's
I'll go
not
crazy.
good for me. Right. And so, so we had a discussion about risks and tolerance and the best times and what she should do. So I think it's a really important point that you
and
just
that's
made.
the trick with wildfire smoke. Like when we're talking about air pollution from other sources, because we've been able to regulate it, we've been able to do it in a really top-down kind of way. This industry cannot emit this much anymore, and it benefits absolutely everyone who lives around this industry. Now we need people to make behavioral changes and personal decisions based on their own risk assessment and perception. And it's just a really different situation that way.
Yeah. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, please.
Just to
Are we
follow?
just asking each other questions now?
Totally fine with me.
No, I'll let Kristen. But one question I have that I always think about is, we've been looking at exposure and the health outcomes to wildfire smoke, but then I think about those people. I've done work in West Africa. They're cooking over open fire with biomass burning every day. Do we see the same kind of health? Unfortunately,
Absolutely.
I don't think the health studies that's a perfect example of long-term exposure to this kind of smoke. Granted,
solid fuel use in low and middle income countries is all of the evidence is the same. Like it's perfectly consistent. with the evidence that we have on these exposures. It's just the context is so different that it's hard to do that kind of generalization to the North American context.
Yeah. So sorry. I just wanted to.
No, that's a very interesting point. Thank you. And definitely feel free to ask each other questions and challenge back and forth. I'm all for that. But as you were both talking, I got to thinking about the trend lines I put up towards the beginning of the call, and they're not good, frankly. So 10 years out, 1 years out, what is this going to look like if you guys had to put your best guess out there? I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but how bad do you think this is going to get? That's a total dark tone I didn't intend there, so apologize.
I often show a slide in my presentations when I'm talking about wildfire that sort of starts at the beginning of my career in BC, which is 2003, and then highlights every year that was a record-setting year from 2003 forward. And there have been now, I believe, 7 record-setting years since 2003. So I think we have to expect that trend to continue. My perspective is always we need to go into every season expecting that it's the worst season we'll ever see and planning for that. If we don't, that's fantastic. We can hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And that's really the only sane way in our field of work right now to approach summer. And that's both for wildfire and extreme heat. I deal with both in my job, and they're not independent of each other by any stretch of the imagination. But like, we have to assume that every summer is going to be a record-setting summer. And we have to assume that until any kind of changes that we make either in the field of climate change mitigation or forest management practice start to actually influence the wildfire risk on the landscape right now in North America.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I want to go back to the point you made earlier about, prescribed burning and managing the landscape to try to prevent these big fires from happening and to have some control over the situation. I think we need to invest more in. Again, like our forest ecosystems are gigantic. And so, we can't do everything everywhere. But I think some of the science has advanced to know where our highest risk areas are in terms of the forest ecosystems and the weather and the climate. And so maybe we could start identifying areas and doing managing the landscape, going back to indigenous practices so that we can I don't think we're gonna change the trajectory, but help manage it somewhat.
I'm happy you brought that up too, Christine, because that's where I was going to go next. Can you speak a little bit about what potential modeling capabilities there are now to identify those high risk areas? And maybe as a second part of that, how has the map of those high risk areas changed over the last years?
Well, that's a great question. So I would say that our tools to predict the climate system, to better understand the forest ecosystem have really advanced. We have climate models that integrate the biosphere with the atmosphere and the oceans and all the different components of the Earth system, which help us identify where and when we think things might be more at risk than others. One of the biggest challenges we have on a modeling landscape is we can do climate scale out, 10, 20, 30 years, and we can do the weather scale out 10, 15 days. But getting the seasonal to subseasonal prediction, I think, is a really, it's a big target area in the scientific community where we can say, okay, it's the spring. What is later on the summer going to look like? And I think those models are still really advancing. And, I've been involved in a lot of community level discussions to talk about where and how that's going to be done. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see huge advances in our ability to predict at those scales to help us better understand where the biggest risk is going to be in the months ahead so that we can plan accordingly, deploy our resources and do what we can to address it, and then prepare the communities as well. So when we have these predictions, we can also say, okay, this is where and when, or what the forest might look like. This is what the fires might look like. These are the emissions when you have the fires, and this is what the air quality impacts look like. So we have a whole host of different, like from a modeling standpoint, we have really fine scale fire weather models that can predict a specific fire and what's happening weather-wise at that specific fire. And then we have larger scale models that can predict the smoke and where that smoke goes and who will be impacted. And then we have climate level models that can talk about like the climate system, what happens on longer time scales.
Interesting. I came up as an air dispersion modeler in large part from stationary sources,
Yep.
power plants, stuff like that. So I obviously understand this is very, very different, but a lot of the same general ideas. Another question popped in my mind as you were speaking. What role and potential benefits do satellite-based systems have on these various models?
I think personally, I think there's huge like possibilities. And I think the satellites that we've had in the air and the data that have been produced have actually really helped a lot of our modeling efforts. Everything from better characterizing what's on the ground to tell us what the forests are, what state they are in, how dense they are, how dry they are, to better understand the weather system. I think, there's been huge advances, and they're coming as well, as integrating and using those observations and using AI techniques to better predict and fill in gaps where we don't know. And there's a lot more coming. I personally use satellite data to describe landscapes, to tell me what about the vegetation, and then help me identify when and where a fire is burning, how hot it's burning, what it's doing on the surface, so I can best predict what's being put up into the air and getting sent downwind. So I think satellite data are usually important with understanding this whole system and predicting the outcomes, like when and what's happening with the fire and what the outcomes are and downwind impacts of the fires.
Yeah, I would say we couldn't do what we do without satellite data. It would be impossible. Satellite observations run, they contribute the fire data into our models in Canada. They are used to evaluate the quality of, it's just absolutely essential. And I just want to show you my wildland fire sat or wildfire sat. Like, this is Canada's building a satellite platform specifically for wildfire, because it's understood that these data are so valuable that we should be building platforms that specifically are targeted at wildfire and not other parts of the environmental system.
Interesting. And on that topic, obviously the wildfire season last year in Canada was just a whole nother level. Did that change anything and actually how you guys go your everyday? Did that were there any lessons learned there or steps taken to be more resilient, or basically how did the last year affect how you guys operate?
So 2023 across Canada was next level, there's no doubt. If you speak to Canadian wildfire scientists, I think they're still a little bit in awe of what happened. There's some very good research already out about the season. It was a record-setting season in BC as well, but not in the way it was a record-setting season in other parts of the country. So our records got broken, yes, but we've had very severe seasons, that were comparable in the previous decade, where it was really different, especially was in Eastern Canada and the fires in Quebec and Northern Ontario. And, I think what it's done, I'll maybe express some frustration here, is we've known that wildfire smoke was an important public health problem for 20 years out west, and we've been talking about the fact that it's an important public health problem for 20 years. And last year, all of Eastern Canada was like, oh my God, wildfire smoke.
It's so
This seems
true.
really risky.
It happened in the the East Coast got smoked out, and all of a sudden it's a very important problem. And I was like, wait, what? We've been
Exactly. And
yeah.
they all ran around with chickens like their heads cut off, where we were saying like, we'll help you. Like we've been doing this for years. It's actually pretty mature public health practice out west. And so I think a lot of energy got wasted because we're not well connected across the country. And Canada and the US are similar this way. They're huge countries with really different fire regimes all the way across them. And the thing that will come out of last year and make us stronger is there will be a center of excellence in wildfire nationally. And I think everybody's really hoping that will bring us better together as a national community, as opposed to a Western Canada community and the rest of Canada community, which is kind of what it's been to date.
That's definitely interesting. And on the point you guys brought up about the East Coast reaction, do you think, again, just obviously opinion here, that that type of thing was so impactful just because it doesn't happen? All of a sudden, we have this big impact right in front of our face that has never happened before. And do you think that actually caused people to wake up a little bit and pay more attention to all of this?
I saw it. I mean, I actually was in DC during the biggest smoke events. I think the magnitude of the event, and the fact that it doesn't happen regularly on the East Coast, that did get a lot of attention, a lot more people thinking about it. I don't know nationally what, if any, are the implications politically. I love that there's a center of excellence being put together in Canada, and I'm sure we'll be able to take advantage of the expertise there. But yeah, it was eye-opening for a lot of people who don't normally get exposed to such extreme events.
There's also, and I know this even within BC, like when smoke impacts the seat of government, it's different from when it doesn't. So, the fact that Ottawa got hit in Canada and that DC got hit in the US, and cities like New York and Toronto, where a lot of powerful people live, it does change the conversation. The real impetus now is to use people's very short memories to drive things forward, because the one thing I know about working in this field is that 2023 will be forgotten, especially if there aren't severe wildfire seasons in between. It's just the way things go for some reason.
Yeah.
Although you're getting it hit hard this year in Western Canada.
Yes, but that's
that's
every year in Western Canada now, just like it's every year in the Western US, right? It's just wildfire season now. So the fact that a town's burnt down and there's smoke everywhere, that just feels normal now. Well, unfortunately in Canada, we've lost large towns in Canada before, chunks of large towns. Jasper is a slightly different story because it's so iconic nationally.
Yeah. I got to thinking too that back to the fact that the wildfires are burning hotter and consuming more land. And just what does that potentially look like for the composition of wildfire smoke in 10 years, 20 years? Is there any way we could predict what that's going to look like?
Well, I would say when we burn more, we're burning more fuel just in general, right? So more smoke is entering the atmosphere. And then depending on the way it burns, you might have different composition. But, for example, when you have a flaming fire, you have things burning more to completeness, and you'll have more black carbon, more of that black smoke. Interestingly, when you burn a house, you see a big puff of that black smoke too. Whereas normally, like if the fire is burning not as hot, you might get more smoldering, more of the white smoke. So the way that the fires burn does change the chemical composition of the smoke. But I would think, again, I go back to like just the mass and the amount of emissions is really controlled by the severity, because you're burning more fuel. You're not just burning the stuff in the understory, you're burning all the trees, all the wood, everything. So you're putting more up in the sky, and that produces more smoke that people can breathe.
Yeah, and what that looks like into the future, it has been, we've got great climate models for temperatures in the future and precipitation in the future. Climatedata.ca's just released data on fire weather into the future. So that's good, but not actual fire in the future, like modeling fire into the future climate scenario and modeling smoke into the future climate scenario. Some folks have done it. It's been a very academic exercise to date.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say we have really reliable models on what these things are going to look like, in that 2100 scenario or the 2050 scenario.
Interesting. Interesting. And how about on a fundamental level, I suppose, what can be done on a forest management basis to try to help actually mitigate some of this?
I'll let Sarah comment again on just the indigenous practices and what we know about that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tension here right now. And again, this comes from conversations with land managers and fire folks. I'm not those people, but I talk to them quite a lot and I go to meetings with them. The landscape needs fire, and the landscape needs fire to correct some of the risk factors that we've been talking about so far in this conversation. That fire can come in a couple of different ways. It can be deliberately set through cultural burning or prescribed burning, or it can be wildfire that we maybe don't try to suppress, but try to influence so that it doesn't harm things that are of value to us, but it still helps to do some of the work that fire needs to do on the landscape. But what we want is moderate, low to moderate severity wildfire.
Yeah.
These highly severe wildfires that just wipe everything out, they reset the landscape, right? Like that's not going to be forest anymore. It's going to revert to grassland probably. Maybe it'll become forest again, 100 years into the future, but they are stand changing fires. They absolutely disrupt the ecology of that region. So the real question is, how do we get that lower intensity fire onto the landscape and use it to our advantage? And the only real way to do that is through prescribed burning. And prescribed burning is getting more and more challenging to do for a range of reasons. One Christine mentioned earlier, the season's just longer now. So the risk of prescribed burns, there's a shorter window to do it. And if you're doing it outside of that window, the risk of escape and wildfire is getting higher. Communities are more concerned about smoke. And they may resist prescribed fire because of the air quality impacts. And then there's just these tensions around the land and who manages the land. And we see that in Canada when we're talking about Indigenous land stewardship or Crown land stewardship, private ownership of land, all of those things, and trying to negotiate them and still get fire on the landscape. They're very challenging conversations. And I'm sure it's happening in the US, but slightly different flavors of those challenges.
Yeah, it is a political problem on top of everything else that you mentioned, totally. And unfortunately in the US, I would say, we only have so much resources, and because our wildfire seasons have gotten so intense and require so many resources to, respond to, that a lot of the resources for land management are depleted to respond.
Well, that's it. Like all the resources go downstream and we really need them upstream. Like if we invested upstream what we spend in wildfire suppression downstream, we would be in a totally different place, but nobody does that.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of the stuff I put up at the getting of the call on the park fire and the amount of resources already being thrown at
Oh.
that, and it's only 18% contained or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, today I was watching 3 different tankers go to the fires in the Front Range. I mean, and they've already deployed, hundreds of people to fight these fires just in Colorado. And those are just some of what's going on just in the Western US right now. You have the Park Fire, you have fires in Oregon, Washington, Idaho right now.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, and then we're fighting
it's
internationally for
yeah,
resources, right? Like, how
that's
are
right.
we, Canada and US are all trying to bring in Australian wildland firefighters and wildland firefighters from other places. So,
Yes, yes. It's so expensive and so intensive. And yeah, it's
and so unsustainable.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And kind of on that point too, we've talked about a lot of different climate impacts on this podcast to date, and an issue that comes up quite often is how climate change impacts are actually affecting the insurance industry and driving up prices and making decisions for people who might not be able to live in the same place anymore because getting a policy is far too expensive or perhaps not even available anymore. Is the same thing happening in various areas that are actually prone to wildfire?
Oh, yes. I can say personally for my neighborhood, since the Marshall Fire, insurance rates, I think, have tripled or quadrupled for homeowners. I know in California that 2 insurance companies have now refused to insure new home builds in the wildland urban interface where there's fire probability. So it's happening, across the US at least. In terms of, the insurance companies recognize that this is expensive and there's potential for loss. And it's the same thing in hurricane prone areas and areas prone to flooding. So definitely in the US, that's happening.
At the same time in Canada, and I imagine this is happening in the US as well, we see the insurance industry engaging with
Yes,
scientists on this issue.
yes.
Like, they really care about it,
Oh,
for
most
different
definitely.
reasons maybe than we do, and maybe not. But there's a lot of really good people in the insurance industry who are also looking at ways to address this challenge.
I totally agree. And in fact, we've had a couple of postdocs from our go to work for the insurance company, different insurance companies to provide better predictions and better assessments of risk so, they can manage it properly. Another thing, this is a little bit off topic, but I am most impressed. I recently went to a meeting where we had several different representatives from utilities
Yeah.
at the table, and the amount of resources and expertise that they're like applying to understand systems so that to reduce the risk of human caused fires because of utility lines. It amazed me how much effort and expertise there and resources they are putting into that to prevent fires and of course they're a profit driven, they have an economic reason for doing this. But I think there's a lot of expertise out there now in the private sector to help manage and prevent wildland fires and to better manage the system.
Mhm.
Now, I think you basically just actually answered this, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, slightly different way. Do you think you've seen enough, and both you obviously answer this if you can, from industrial sectors and industrial companies identifying wildfire as a tangible risk and trying to plan out what those impacts could be to their businesses?
I would say yes. Go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I would say this is a kind of a tough one. One of the things we've been trying to do is, you know, wildland fire can turn into anything kind of fire. It can turn
Yeah.
into industrial fire, it can turn into interface fire, and there's certainly industrial complexes where if they were to be impacted by wildland fire, the downstream effects of that smoke might be so severe that we would want to consider evacuating those populations to protect them from that smoke. So we've been trying to identify those types of facilities in BC so that we have a list and it says, facility X is going to catch on fire in 2 days, we can say, okay, we can do the risk assessment and say, okay, we need to evacuate population Y to protect them from that smoke. And trying to gather those data has been challenging. So I'm quite sure that these facilities are doing the work necessary to plan for wildfire. They know they're at risk, they know where they're located, they understand how challenging things have been nationally for the past couple of decades, but there still needs to be that connection between public and private sector to work together on the issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it made me think of even just public utilities and public. I know locally our water treatment plant has been hardening themselves against the potential for being impacted by fire. But yeah, I'll just go back to the utilities, because utilities are often the cause of
Mm.
some of these fires from power lines. This has happened in California, it happened here in Colorado. Well, still to be determined the cause of one fire, but there's a lot of lawsuits and it's very costly. So they have an um, economic reason to better protect, and harden their systems to prevent wildfires and to protect them from fires. So yeah, but I agree, having more intersection between the public and private sectors, the academic sectors, so that we are all working on the same page to protect resources, infrastructure, and public health. There's still a lot that could be done.
I like that. And frankly, I always try to end our discussions on this podcast, and we're starting to come up on time a little bit, but I try to always strike a hopeful tone because a lot of these topics can be extremely, extremely daunting, even frightening to some. We're talking about fire, we're talking about people losing their homes, economic impacts, a lot of heavy, heavy stuff. What gives you both hope while doing this type of work?
Well, I don't know. I think, we can better predict the system so we can better respond and protect ourselves. Uh, we are resilient. We can learn from what's happened. I'm seeing, for example, again, in my area, we learn from our experience. And so we can harden our homes, we can be better prepared. We're more aware of the system to protect ourselves from smoke and exposures. Um, it's amazing. A long time ago when I started, people didn't know what ozone was. People didn't even appreciate what particles. And when you had an air quality, you know, alert day, I talk to people and they're like, we have no idea what that is, whatever, and now people are much more aware and understanding of how to protect themselves, how to mitigate exposures. So I think just public awareness of some of the issues, I think will help motivate change in a positive direction moving forward.
For me, it's all about the people. I come into work every day because I work with incredibly committed professionals who care about this day in and day out, and year in and year out. And they just keep grinding and they just keep working. And I see things getting better. And it really is about the fact that people care and are trying to make a difference, and they're working really hard to do that. I find that very motivating, and that's what keeps me doing what I'm doing.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And um, we're starting a little tight on time, so I think I'm going to ask the last question. So I was a variation of the same, but after doing a couple of these episodes, I started to notice in the demographics that a large percentage of college students and graduate students, people still studying, have been paying attention to this podcast. What advice would you potentially have for them if they wanted to get into this line of work and look into climate impacts or wildfire impacts? And potentially, are there any resources you could recommend?
Oh, well, this could be a whole other podcast for me. I would say there are so many paths that they could take where they could have an impact on this topic, I guess, from the private sector, pursuing academic research to working in the public sector, policy, land management. I mean, there's just, public health. It's just so many options and places where they can have a positive impact. There's a ton of resources out there. I would offer, if you want to put my email address out, I run a jobs list that sends out job opportunities for people doing work in the earth sciences and anything related. So there's a lot of options out there. I'm really excited for the next generation of students and coming up, because I feel like there's so many cool opportunities, so many amazing tools, so many places where they can make an impact. And yeah, we actually hold a lot of seminars and do workshops and have tools available and resources available. So I'm happy to share them if they want to contact me afterwards.
I will definitely take you up on that, because one of the things I like to try and add to each of these, if the experts have any type of resources or suggestions, we always add them to the episode notes afterward.
Okay, super.
My perspective is going to be a little bit more specific, and it is learn to code.
Oh,
Christine can't do what she does without computer science as a fundamental skill set. I can't do what I do without computer science as a fundamental skill set. It is the basis on which so much of this work is going to be built into the coming years. Facility with data, comfort with data, ability to make data do what you need it to do, geospatial data, large data sets, satellite, any of those data, just being able to manipulate them and get them to give you the answers you want from them is the fundamental skill set from my perspective. Now, there's roles for people who don't want to learn to code, but if you're kind of technically inclined and you're thinking about how to develop a career in this field, doing a data science program or something that's really going to give you that ability with the data will pay off.
That's great.
definitely.
That's great. And frankly, it makes me think back to what got me into environmental in the first place forever ago, it feels like. I wanted to try to positively impact the environment. And frankly, I wanted a job that I would have job security in. So I think the smart thinking there and around the same general mindset you guys just both shared. So I just want to thank you both very, very much. These podcast episodes end up being like little TED Talks, honestly, for me. I feel like I learned a lot. So that's amazing. And for everyone listening, this will be posted in the next coming weeks. There will be resources in the episode notes. And as both Christine and Sarah said, there's encouragement to get involved. So, and a lot of opportunities, sounds like. So thank you again both for participating today, and for everyone listening. If you're not already subscribing, we're available on all major podcast platforms. And the video of this episode is available online, actually, YouTube as well. And tune in next time. I think we're doing an environmental justice episode on Chicago. So very, very interesting stuff. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.